All right, Assalamu alaikum. This is 4.05, Introduction to Recycling. So we're going to be talking about recycling and stuff like that. So let's take a look at this picture over here. All right, so this picture over here is showing various types of ways that we can generate electricity. All right, so electricity is used to run all of the houses and even sometimes electric cars and all those kinds of things. So what are the different ways that people generate electricity? So in this picture is giving you a few different types, right? So you have solar energy over here. Solar energy is energy from the sun. You might have solar panels and that kind of thing. Over here you have a hydroelectric plant. So what does that mean, right? So here's like a dam, right? And so as soon as it stores a bunch of water up here. You build this thing here, and all of a sudden water cannot just flow through. So what you do is you see these tiny holes here, so you open it up from time to time and let the water run. And so when the water runs from here through this hole, through the dam here, out over here, that process turns some wheels. And so when you turn that, you can use it to generate electricity. Just like if you have let's suppose you have a water wheel, right? So in the old days, people used to have, like water wheels and windmills in order to grind up corn and grain and stuff like that. The wind would turn the blades, and then that would be connected to something that would turn some wheels and gears and stuff. And eventually down below, it does some kind of work. It grinds something, it makes something. It runs a factory maybe, right? So in this case, when the water just flows through, it turns some wheels, and that generates electricity. You have a nuclear power plant here, where you use radioactive material. You have wind power here, same kind of thing as this one, hydroelectric plant, except the blades are turning because of the wind. You have a thermal power plant, so that one works by dealing with temperature differences. So there's different kinds of energy sources, right? So we have different kinds of energy sources in this picture down over here to the right. So some of those energy sources are called renewable, and some are called non-renewable. So what does renewable mean? It means that you can use it again and again and again, or it's something that can regenerate, right? So it means that once you use something up, it's not gone, right? There's still either a lot more left, or you can recycle it and use it again and again and again. Now, non-renewable over here, for example, and in this box, what it means is that once you use these energy sources, then it's difficult to remake them and use them again. So it's much easier to kind of run out of these types of resources. So let's take a look at the renewable resources. You have solar energy. So the sun is, so once you use up some energy from the sun, well, more energy continues to arrive from the sun the next day and the next day and the next day and so on, right? So until when, right, we don't know. But for the time being, it seems like the sun is producing energy, right, day after day after day after day. So even if you use up the energy that's brought to the earth today, well, there's going to be a whole new batch tomorrow. Same kind of thing with the air and the wind, right? So when you turn a wind turbine, the next day there's going to be more wind again. Same thing with the water, right? If you have kind of hydroelectric plants and that kind of thing, rain, the water cycle continues. It's going to rain tomorrow, and that rain is going to collect in the lake and be used to power the turbines again tomorrow, and that kind of thing. Now, non-renewable resources are typically things like fossil fuels, oil, coal. These are things that you can burn. So these things are also being regenerated, but usually at a much slower rate. These things, they took a long time for the earth to make. So these are fossil fuels. So basically, we've talked about fossils before. So when you have a fossil, right, when a plant or animal dies, the carbon in its material, in the dead body of the animal, or in the dead or in the plant material, that eventually turns into fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas. So these things, they believe, come from dead creatures and plants over many, many millions of years. And that's the theory about how most of these fossil fuels have appeared. So when you burn them, if you take some coal from the ground, right, you go to the mine and take out some coal and burn it, then it usually takes, the amount of coal that you burn, you're using it up faster than the coal is being created. Right? So it takes a long time to make coal. So that's why this is called non-renewable. Right? So this picture over here just showing that recycling things, just showing recycling. So another, when it comes to renewable and non-renewable, we've been talking about energy sources, right? But apart from energy sources, there is materials as well, right? There's materials that you use. So different kinds of things that you use, like paper, plastic, glass. Some of these things can be recycled, right? They can be reused again. Like plastic, they can melt it down and then make something out of it again. Same thing with glass. Paper, again, they can blend it together and then they can use the fibers again. So there's limits to how much you can recycle things. So paper, right, comes from trees, right? So when you make paper with it the first time, right, and then every time afterwards that you make it, right? So let's say you take some paper and you blend it down and make new paper again. Blend it down, once that's done, you blend it down and make new paper again. There's only a certain limit of times that you can recycle things like paper. So I don't remember what is the number of times, but you can't just keep recycling it forever and ever. Eventually, the plant fibers that help to make paper, they become too small or damaged, and then and then you can't use them again, and then you have to go cut down more trees. So a lot of these things can be recycled. You can reuse them again. You can melt them down or blend them and use them again. But there's often limits to how many times you can recycle each of these things. So the hydrologic cycle, right? So when we see a term like this, right? So what does this mean? Hydro, right? What does hydro mean? So hydro means water. So whenever you see a word like this, you should always try to break it down and try to figure out what it means first before you go on and just read about it. So if you do that, then it's going to be easier to remember things and figure out things. So you have hydro, like some kind of water cycle. Cycle means it goes around and around and around. So water on the earth, it goes through a cycle, right? So we've seen things like the water cycle like this before, right? You see how overall it kind of goes in a circle. The condensation goes over here, down here, over here, and then back up to the beginning again. So that's called a cycle. It means it's going through the same things again and again and again. So the water cycle, right, is one thing that is recycled again and again and again. Other things are also cycled. Carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. All of these things are used in one place, then used in another place, another place, another place, and eventually it makes its way back to the beginning again. So these kinds of cycles are called biogeochemical cycles. So let's take a look at some of the things in the water cycle. So over here, right, we have an ocean or a lake or something like that. We have some kind of body of water. And what happens to this water? Well, it evaporates and goes up into the sky, right? Now, when it rises high enough, it cools down, right? So when it cools down, it turns into tiny, tiny water droplets that make up the clouds. That's called condensation. So eventually when you have a whole lot of that, when it gets like too much, then it can't just stay up in the sky forever. They turn into larger water droplets and they become heavy enough to where they can start falling down as rain. It's called precipitation. And then, so eventually the precipitation, through lakes and streams and stuff like that, it makes its way back to the ocean or the large bodies of water or groundwater or wherever water is stored, and that's called collection. From there, it again evaporates again. So you can see it's going in a cycle, right? It's going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So now evaporation, right? So this is the basic water cycle. So there's other, small parts of the water cycle that are also important. So one thing we notice here, right? So we notice that a lot of water is coming off of the ocean, right? So this is an easy place for water to evaporate from. Now you see from the trees, there's also some kind of lines going up over here as well, right? So there's water coming out of the trees, right? So water and other living things, they all have, trees and other living things, they all have water in them, right? So water is coming out of the trees, and it also goes up into the sky, right? But this is like a small part. This is like a small part of the water that's going into the sky. Most of it is coming from the ocean and different bodies of water like that. But other living things, they also release a little bit of water. So these are the different parts of the water cycle, right? We've talked about evaporation, right? So evaporation lifts water vapor into the atmosphere from the oceans, land surfaces, and bodies of water. So this is affected by different things, right? Like the higher the temperature there is, for example, right, the more water is going to evaporate. Right? If it's a hotter day, more water is going to go up into the sky. If there's higher amounts of wind, more water is going to be evaporated. If there's a lower atmospheric pressure, if there's a lower vapor pressure, this is basically like the amount of water that's already kind of in the air, or the amount of water that's already in the air. So if there's already like a lot of water in the air, a little bit less is going to evaporate. So this is affected by a lot of different things. Condensation is basically when this water vapor, which is basically water as a gas, not as a liquid, goes into the air and forms tiny drops. So basically, why does it form tiny drops? Because it cools down, right? So it cools down, and in the air, there's small airborne particles. So around you, right, the air looks clear, but the air is filled with tiny, like microscopic particles of all kinds of things, like dust and just all kinds of stuff. So that's also up, high up in the sky. So when there's a lot of water in the air and it cools down, it starts to form small droplets around all these tiny microscopic particles, and each of those basically becomes like one raindrop. So when water evaporates and goes into the air, right, it doesn't automatically condense. It has to reach what's called the saturation point. So when it cools down enough, when that point is reached, that temperature is reached, that's called the saturation point, and all of a sudden it turns from a gas back into tiny drops of water and eventually rain. Now we talked about water vapor coming out of the trees. So that process is called this transpiration, right? So inside of the plants, inside of the leaves of plants, there are tiny holes or pores called stomata. So these are tiny holes in leaves, and that's where all the water comes out of and goes up into the sky. Precipitation is rain and other kinds of things, rain, snow, or sleet, right? Now, when the water rains to the ground, it can collect in many different places. So it can collect in lakes, rivers, and oceans, which are known as surface water. That's water that's like right on the surface that you see. There's also water that's hidden in the ground, right? So if you go over here, we see this water here, right? If you go to the ocean, you see the water. But actually below you in the ground, there's also water as well. So let's suppose it rains over here, all right? So when it rains over here on this side on the right, all right, then eventually a lot of the water is just going to seep right into the ground and go into the groundwater, right? Some other water is going to go directly into the ocean. Other water is going to go into lakes and streams that eventually get to the ocean. So these kinds of small streams and things that are often found in the mountains and stuff like that, this is called runoff, right? So this is called runoff. So these are basically, when it rains and stuff, it forms into small streams. So these streams eventually go into kind of bigger streams and bigger, and eventually goes into rivers, and the rivers eventually go into the ocean. So these tiny amounts of streams that form from the rain is called runoff. And this again, it's just showing some explaining the previous items a little bit more. So this right here is called transpiration. Remember, this is coming from the plants. See, water evaporates from tiny pores from the leaves, right? It eventually came from the ground, right? From the roots, the plant is taking up water. It goes up into the stem, into the leaf, and then transpiration into the air. This over here is showing us groundwater, right? So let's suppose you're standing over here, there's trees, it looks like land, right? But if you dig below deep enough, you can hit water. And there's all this groundwater below. So when it rains, some of the water is going to flow here into the surface water right over here. But some of it's just going to seep right through and stay in the groundwater. So the space below the ground, if you go deep enough, between the tiny, particles of rock and sand and stuff, there's, it's completely surrounded by water. So the water cycle is very important because this is important to living organisms, including animals. So animals and other organisms, they all have water within them. So water is useful. Water is used in living things for many different things. So most of the cell is water. In addition, we talked about cellular respiration before, when cells basically burn sugars and stuff like that in order to make energy. So water is a byproduct of that reaction as well. So living organisms are filled with water. And water comes in when they drink the water, and then it's also expelled in urine as well as with every breath. So if you see like an animal that's very hot outside, it might be panting, and water is evaporating off of its tongue, and maybe it's sweating, and that helps to cool it down. So water is coming in and out of the living organisms all the time. Now living things are made mostly of carbon. This is an element in the periodic table. Like there's carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, all these different kinds of things. Carbon is the main thing that makes up is the main thing besides water molecules that makes up living things. So carbon is found in every living thing on Earth, right? And so the foods that we eat, those are usually plants or animals. They're filled with carbon. The trees are filled with carbon. The animals are filled with carbon, and all those kinds of things. Now, in addition, carbon dioxide, diamonds, and limestone, they also have a lot of carbon in them as well. So if something's made of carbon, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's alive. But it does mean that living things are mostly carbon if you take away the water. Right? So there's also a carbon cycle as well. Right? So what is the carbon cycle? Well, carbon cycle is basically how carbon moves throughout the environment. So in the atmosphere, we have carbon dioxide. So this is showing you a lot of the things that's going on. So in the atmosphere, there's a lot of carbon dioxide, right? So there's carbon dioxide, and so what happens, right? Plants, they take it in order to make food, right? Remember, when it comes to photosynthesis, the plants are taking in carbon dioxide, right? So carbon dioxide is taken in, all right, and so these plants, they're using it, and it can transfer between different kinds of creatures, right? Now, in addition, in the ocean and in different kinds of bodies of water, there's also a lot of dissolved carbon dioxide as well. And there are many, many different kinds of creatures in the water that actually use carbon to make, skeletons and shells and all different kinds of things like that. So, we have, in the ocean, there's all kinds of microorganisms, right? So they make, shells and different things that have a kind of chalky kind of texture, right? If you know what chalk is something that you use to like write on the board, right? So what is chalk? Like, where does chalk come from? So chalk comes from the remains. Commercially, whatever you buy in the store, who knows where that comes from? But where, like traditionally, in the environment, where does chalk come from? It comes from the remains of organisms from before. So there are actually, in certain parts of the world, there are actually cliffs that are made entirely of chalk. They're just like completely white. So in the UK, there's a place called the White Cliffs of Dover. So this is like kind of like a chalky kind of substance. So what is that? That's basically calcium carbonate. So what is carbonate? It has carbon in it. It's partly made of carbon. So these different kinds of organisms here, right? They use carbon, the dissolved carbon dioxide. They turn it into calcium carbonate and other kinds of things, and they use it here. And so when they die, it forms a sediment at the bottom of the ocean, right? So it forms at the bottom of the ocean, it forms sediment. And so, the remains of all these shells, they compact over time, and, people, they either just stay down there or people use them for different kinds of things. In addition, when all of these living kind of organisms, they die, they also form fossil fuels. So when they die, eventually they form oil and coal and other kinds of things in the earth. And then let's suppose people burn fossil fuels. So what's going to happen? That carbon is going to go back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So you can kind of see it forms like this kind of a cycle, right? There's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, all right? It's used by plants to make food. Other animals, they eat the plants and they incorporate it into themselves. When these creatures die, or when the creatures in the ocean die, they form sediments and fossil fuels and things like that. And eventually that can be released back into the atmosphere when you burn them. And it's a lot more complicated than this. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of these other things going on. But overall, this is how the cycle works, going back and forth, back and forth. So let's take a look at some of this again. Let's review the carbon cycle a little bit again. So photosynthesis, right? This is when plants are making food. So they take in carbon dioxide from the air for photosynthesis, right? So so other creatures might come in and eat the plants, and so they also take some of that carbon. When these living things die, they are broken down by decomposers, right? The decomposition process deposits carbon that is stored in the ground and rocks and soil, right? So when a lot of these things die, these animals, plants, and so on, eventually they form these compact layers. And when there's a lot of these compact layers with a lot of heat and pressure in the ground, it's turned into these different, into coal, different kinds of fossil fuels like oil and all different kinds of things like that. So the carbon from the air eventually turns into fossil fuels. Now, the fossil fuels, a person might take them out of the ground, right? Over here, they're extracting them. They either have like an oil well, or they have coal mines, or people going down and getting coal. So they take it to a power plant and burn it. So when you burn it, right, obviously that's going to go back into the air where it came from. In addition, right, so that's kind of like one simple cycle, right? But obviously there's the carbon is going in and out of other places. So here's some other things that are going on, right? So the plant, before it dies and becomes part of the fossil fuels, maybe someone burns it, right? Maybe there's a lightning strike and the tree catches on fire and it starts to burn. So before it becomes fossil fuels, it already starts to burn. The carbon already starts to burn, and the carbon goes back up into the air, right? So this is one way in which carbon dioxide can come into a plant, and then if the plant burns, it can go back into the air, right? Without going down and becoming fossil fuels first. So that's mostly on land, right? So in the water, right, there are different kinds of creatures. There's different kinds of organisms. So there's a lot of there's a lot of microorganisms in the water that use carbon dioxide. So where does the carbon dioxide in the water comes from? Well, the air above it, right, obviously has some carbon dioxide, right? The air around us has oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide and different things. So some of that just becomes dissolved in the water, right? So the water has all kinds of dissolved gases like oxygen. That's why a fish is able to live there, because there is oxygen down here. And carbon dioxide and whatever gases are in the air, there's some of that in the ocean. So some creatures, right, some microscopic creatures, first of all, they're talking about plants here. So again, just as plants in the plants on land use carbon dioxide, some of the plants here in the water, they could also take in carbon. And then they're just saying that, so some of the carbon could be transferred to fish. Another thing is that there are a lot of microorganisms that also use the carbon to make shells. Now, when all these different kinds of organisms, they die, whether it's the fish or the plants or the microorganisms that you use to make shells and stuff like that, when they die, they fall to the ocean floor and they become sediment. Sediment is just like, sediment is just like whatever, like rocks and sand and tiny particles of things that, that are lying on the ground somewhere. So they just fall to the ground here and they form these layers of sediment at the ground, right? So it could be, just like, if a tree dies here and eventually becomes fossil fuels here in the ground, same thing here. Over time, it just, the dead things just become compacted, and there's a lot of heat and pressure that is applied to it over millions of years, and it can turn into fossil fuels. And so we talked about this a little bit, right? So, some organisms, they use carbon in the water to form shells and things like that. And same thing, they also become part of the sediment. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of renewable resources and non-renewable resources. So what are renewable resources? They're things that can be used again and again and again. So like when you use them, it's easy for the earth or the sun or whatever to regenerate them, to make some more again quickly. So here's some renewable resources. So this one right over here is called so one is called biomass energy. So what is biomass, right? So there are these things called biomass power plants that generate electricity. So what they do is they basically so what is biomass? It's basically just like living things that are dead now, right? So wood, pieces of garbage, stuff like that. So they just burn all of these things and then use it to make electricity. So it's not really a clean energy source because you're burning things and releasing a lot of chemicals and greenhouse gases and stuff like that back into the air. You have solar power. This is renewable. We talked about that before. Solar power is renewable because the sun continues to create more and more light energy every day. And so when you use the solar, the light from one day, it doesn't really affect like how much light is coming to you the next day. Wind power, same thing, right? You're using wind. So if you use some of the wind today to make electricity, like tomorrow, it doesn't really matter. There's similar amount of wind on average is going to be made tomorrow. Hydropower is when you build dams across water sources. Now, when you do that, so we talked about it in the first slide. So you slowly let the water through in order to generate electricity. Now, when you do that, however, that obviously causes a lot of changes in the ecosystems, right? So before, the water was just flowing through. There was like this, there was a river that was just flowing through, and so there was a certain ecosystem. There were certain fish that were living there, animals, plants, different. There's a certain ecosystem that was there. So when you do this, all of a sudden you block a river. So what happens is that behind the block, water is going to gather, and it's going to form like some giant lake. Well, all of a sudden, you suddenly changed what that environment is. Now, all of a sudden, the animals who used to live there, they can't really live there anymore, and different kinds of animals are going to have to come and live there now. So when you build these kinds of dams, oftentimes what it does is that it blocks certain kinds of fish from living there and going where they need to go. So salmon, for example, whenever dams are built on rivers, then salmon, they often are one creature that are harmed by this. Geothermal energy. All right, so what is geothermal energy? So geothermal energy over here. So first of all, this picture over here just shows biomass, right? So people take all these different things and they just burn them, right? So you can use all these waste products maybe for energy, but it's going to release a lot of smoke into the air. Now, what is geothermal energy? So what does that mean? Geo means like earth. Thermal, right? What does thermal mean? It means like heat or warmth. So you're using the heat inside the earth to generate electricity. So if you go down into the ground, right, if you go down really far, it becomes warmer and warmer and warmer, right? Like that's why, like lava that comes up from the ground in volcanoes is very hot. And you keep going down into the earth and burying into the center of the earth, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, right? So these power plants, they use some of that energy. Obviously, they don't dig down like too far down, but they just dig down enough to where they can get to like a warmer place, right? So the rocks down here, okay, are warm, right? So the rocks down here are warmer than the surface, right? So you can use that difference in temperature in order to generate electricity. So how does that really work? So this shows you a little bit about how that works, right? So notice down here, right, in the ground, it's very very warm or even hot, right? So what they do is they pump a bunch of water down here, right? So they pump the water down here, and so when it's close here to the magma and the lava and stuff, it becomes really, really hot, right? It really heats up a lot. So it heats up so much that it can turn into steam, right? It turns from the liquid into water vapor. And so the water vapor is, expands in size and starts bubbling out of here and forces its way through this, through this turbine. This turbine is basically kind of like the same thing as like a windmill or like a water wheel, those kinds of things, right? If steam is moving through here quickly, it's going to start to turn this thing. It's going to start to turn this wheel, just like a fan wheel can be turned. So when that wheel is turned by the steam, like pushing through, right? Because when you put water down here, this starts to bubble and that steam starts pushing its way through at a high pressure. Then that turning of the wheel generates electricity. Right? It's connected to this generator, and then generates electricity, and that can be used somewhere else. Right? So you're pumping water down here to turn into steam, and when you form steam, right? The steam can't just stay trapped here, right? Because steam is gas, right? That takes up more space than water. So it forces its way out of this tube, right? And keeps moving through this turbine, right? And that turns this wheel and generates electricity. So these are some examples of non-renewable resources. These are resources that take a longer time in order to regenerate. So when you use them, we're using them faster than the rate at which they're being made. So coal is one. This is a fossil fuel. So this releases carbon dioxide and water vapor, and there are other kinds of. So there's releases carbon dioxide and water vapor, which are greenhouse gases, as we talked about in 4.04. In addition, it can release a lot of other chemicals. There are different kinds of sulfur compounds and stuff like that are found in coal. They're often released. So some of those are cleaned up. Some of those, they've put filters on some coal burning power plants so that some of the worst things are not put into the air, right? But still, some greenhouse gases are still being put into the air. In addition, where do you get coal from? You have to dig coal mines. And so that can create a lot of problems, right? So you have to, you have to go somewhere into the mountain, and, you have to, sometimes they, when they dig there, it can collapse collapse like a side of the mountain, or collapse the ground or the side of a mountain, or they have to clear some of the land, so it can damage the habitat in the land when you go there to mine coal. In addition, people have lung diseases from mining coal, because the coal dust gets into the lungs and can cause different kinds of lung problems. Oil is also a fossil fuel, right? So it also produces carbon dioxide and water vapor, right? So oil is where you get like gasoline and stuff. This is basically a liquid, and so you can get gasoline from petroleum or oil. Natural gas is basically like a gas that is usually like methane and other kinds of gas. So same thing, they also use carbon dioxide and water vapor. I think they say that natural gas is usually cleaner than some of these other things, but they still are producing greenhouse gases. Nuclear power is when you use the breakdown of radioactive elements like uranium or plutonium, stuff like that, to produce heat, and then that heat, again, turns water into steam and generates electricity through some kind of a turbine. So nuclear energy, right, doesn't release any greenhouse gases, but it could, if you don't use it properly, it could produce radiation, and there could be like a nuclear meltdown. So then, the surrounding animals and people and everything could get like cancer and stuff like that if there is too much radiation. So this one has certain advantages, but also some disadvantages as well. So this is just showing like what is natural gas. So natural gas is usually a mixture of gases underneath the ground, consisting mostly of methane, along with small amounts of both hydrocarbon and non-hydrocarbon gases. So we talked about methane last time. Methane is also a greenhouse gas, but usually the methane is first burned to produce carbon dioxide and water. So how does oil and natural gas form? So basically, it's basically kind of a fossil fuel. So tiny marine plants and animals died and were buried on the ocean floor. So when these animals died and they sink to the bottom, they're buried on the ocean floor. And eventually layer after layer after layer after layer forms, right? And then heat and pressure, right? Like the stuff here at the bottom is under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of weight of all this stuff on top of it, on top of this layer of dead animal remains. And so that heat and pressure turns it into oil and natural gas. And the people drill there and get the oil and natural gas out to burn it.